Hi there, my name is Vlad Tucakov and I'm with Point Grey Research. And I'm here to give you a presentation called USB 3 is here. This is a third presentation in series that I started back in 2009 when we first presented our USB 3 prototype. So the blue camera that you see here was the USB 3 camera we prototyped back then and we displayed. Last year we presented a product line with USB 3, and this year I'm happy to say that we are actually shipping the USB 3 products. And it's very exciting actually. USB 3, I was actually blown away in the recent months in terms of the acceptance both by the customers who are calling about the USB 3 products that we have, but also the way the industry has embraced USB 3 as well. A little bit of background on USB 3. So basically USB 3 is an extension of USB 2, but the important part is that physically USB 3 is different than USB 2. And USB 3 is governed by the USB Implementation Forum, and basically this is the logo that signifies USB 3 certified products. And I'll talk a little bit more about this towards the end of the presentation. Now, what you need to understand about USB is that USB in general is produced in billions of ports a year in the consumer market. And what we see here is a forecast of what's going to happen in terms of USB 2 and USB 3. So what we are seeing is a general increase, general trend and increase of USB ports that are being produced worldwide in the consumer market. And we're also we will start seeing an increase in USB 3 and decrease in USB 2 ports, which is perfectly normal. The other thing is that we're expecting is that by 2014 or so, 100% of the PC market will actually come with USB 3 ports as well. So it's so we expect that it's going to be completely ubiquitous. You will essentially not be able to buy a PC that does not have USB 3. And today you can buy many PCs that do have USB 3, and in fact the laptop, the Lenovo that I have here, has a USB 3 port on it. Now I want to tell you a little bit about consumer acceptance so that you have an idea of where we are. So just to throw some numbers, I will not go into very much detail about this, is that Asus, for example, has shipped 2 million USB 3 motherboards. Gigabyte is expected to ship 7.5 million. Renesas, which makes the host controllers, has shipped 30 million units, and so on. AMD, Intel, all the big players are going to be supporting USB 3. And the vendors that you see at the bottom, there are 7 of them, are actually making host controller USB 3 cards as well today. So I don't want to spend this presentation sort of reading off specifications of USB 3 to you. I think you guys can do a simple Google search and you can find all this information. What I want to do is give you an idea of practical what actually works and what doesn't work when it comes to USB 3, because we have been actually manufacturing and testing USB 3 cameras for an extended period of time now, particularly the testing part. So theoretically, USB 3 can do 400 megabytes worth of bandwidth, and that is a lot. You know, to give you an idea, GigE Vision, for example, or Gigabit Ethernet can do 100 megabytes per second. So this is 4 times more bandwidth that you can get from Gigabit Ethernet, for example. To give you an idea, we're demonstrating here a camera that can do 190 megabytes per second, which is 1080p, so 1900 by 1800, YUV422 at 48 frames per second, running on a Gen 2 by 1 interface card. And to sort of figure out, okay, well, how fast can we actually go? We have also done a test which went up to 280 megabytes per second, and the details of the actual setup are presented there as well. Now, one thing that you need to keep in mind is that the motherboard you choose can have some limitations. So one of the important things is that some of the PCIe Gen 2 × 1 interface motherboards actually cannot reach the full speeds. So some of them, even though they present 9 gigabytes per second, they can only do 2.5 gigabytes per second. And we actually have our driver, which I'll be talking about later, will be able to tell you whether you're actually getting the PCI bandwidth or not. Now, one of the questions also that comes up is, well, how many devices can I have on USB 3? Because a lot of people want to have multiple devices because USB 3, in a sense, is an extension of FireWire and the sort of the multiple camera ability of FireWire that we have today. So to give you an idea, the theoretical number of devices is 255 units. The issue, however, is that the host controller card that you have on your card is the actual limiting factor. So the cameras that are, or the host controller cards that are shipping today can give you about 30 units or so. Renesas is about 30, and I think NEC is about 31, something around there. So Point Grey performs long-term tests with 24 cameras running on one PC. And we use 3 host adapters, we use 6 hubs, and they're all put in a network to test these cameras over an extended period of time. And the power that is supplied to the cameras is delivered through the hubs themselves. And the image that you see down below is one of the tests. It's sort of not it illustrates essentially what the camera setup is like. Now, the other thing that comes up is the architecture. And one really important thing, particularly in this market, is that a lot of people say, well, I don't like USB 2, I've had a bad experience with USB 2, I will not touch USB ever again, things like that. The important point is that USB 3, the actual physical connection, is completely separate from the USB 2 physical connection that we have on USB 2 devices. So in the cable itself, you actually have 2 sets of cables. And so when you connect to USB 3, the USB 2 portion is not active at all. So that's an important part. So it's a separate interface altogether. And that particular interface is actually based on PCI Express technology rather than the USB 2 technology. So one of the important aspects of the architecture and how things work is the CPU overhead. And the specific example that we're showing here is that in the example which I mentioned previously, where we had 280 megabytes per second streaming into the PC, on a i7 processor, the CPU usage was between 1 and 2%. So essentially, USB 3 and DMAing straight to the memory is very efficient, and you can actually use your CPU time to do the processing itself. The other important thing, although there are people who don't necessarily like USB 2, there are actually people who rely on USB 2. They have to have USB 2 for their customers, for example, if they don't provide a PC with their imaging solution. So one of the important things is that USB 3 is actually backwards compatible. And the solution is actually quite clever. The connector that you see on the top right, which looks like a USB 2 connector, is actually a USB 3 connector on the cable. And that connector can be plugged in both into a USB 2 port or into a USB 3 port. And the way it's done is basically there's a set of pins where if you plug the camera in sort of to a certain distance, you get USB 2, and then you plug it in the connector further, you actually get USB 3. Okay? So what that means is that you can plug a USB 2 device into a USB 3 port, you can plug a USB 3 device into a USB 2 port, and you can do all the combinations. So in order to sort of be sure that what I'm saying here is actually true, I took my laptop and I took 2 of our cameras, one USB 2, one USB 3, and I literally went and I plugged in the USB 2 camera into the USB 3 and the USB 2 port. I plugged in the USB 3 camera into the USB 2 and USB 3 port, and it all worked. And then what I did was, it's this portion here of the camera side, so to speak. This portion is actually your USB 2 connector that you have, on your cell phone right here, right? So I plug that camera into our USB 3 camera, and then I plug the other side into the USB 3 port, forcing the USB 3 port camera to behave like a USB 2 camera on a USB 3 port, and that worked as well. So I sort of convinced myself that it's actually all the So it's backwards compatible, and I was satisfied myself that it was. Another question is operating systems. So what operating systems are going to be available? So one important news is that Microsoft Windows 8 will actually be supporting USB 3, and there's actually a quote which you can find on the internet that specifies that as well. There's also a Linux open source USB 3 driver in the works. And there's also a Mac OS driver, which is currently specific to hard drives, that is available, and I've sort of provided that link there as well. Now, Point Grey, what we've decided was to actually build or design a driver from scratch, because in the industry that we're in, it's extremely important that you actually have full end-to-end solution, so that you're not relying on the device drivers provided by the host controller chip makers or the device or the operating system makers. So in order to having developed the device driver from scratch, so to speak, and having full control over what it does, we also provide some of the functionality that is not available from the drivers that are available in the consumer space. So some examples are, for example, that you can get the network topology. So when you have a network of cameras with a off-the-shelf driver, you actually don't know which port the camera is plugged into. But with our driver, what you'll do is you'll actually get a graphical representation of the network that the cameras are sitting on. And why is this important? The reason it's important is, for example, if you have an application where you have two cameras, and suppose you have a left eye and a right eye for some kind of eye examination machine, and suppose that you want to replace one of the cameras, well, what you with knowing the network topology, what you can do is you can simply replace one camera, put another one on, and you know where that camera is. If you don't have that information, you have no way of knowing which camera is which. So you have to rely on serial numbers or some other way of knowing which camera it is, and you certainly don't want to mistake the eyes when you're doing your exam. So in addition to that, the driver also provides you the amount of PCI bandwidth you have between USB 3 and the PC itself, so that you know and you're sure that the amount of data that is going across is available to you. Because in some cases, like I mentioned previously, the amount of data coming across from PCI or from USB 3 is actually larger than what is available on PCI itself. So you have to be careful about that as well. Power management. So an important thing is that if you are using a bunch of USB 2 cameras, you might find that there's not enough power provided to the cameras. USB 3 provides more power. So we're going from about 2.5 watts to about 4.5 watts. And one interesting bit that has just come to light is that with USB 3, there's a special mode you can put your host controller card into for the power for charging your USB devices, where you can get actually 7.5 frames per second. 7.5 watts. So the amount of power provided by the host controller itself is larger, meaning that you don't have to actually separately power the cameras themselves. Now, one of the important things, and this is, every interface, there's not a perfect interface, and if I was to sort of pick one thing that it comes to USB 3 and say, okay, this is not exactly 100%, is the actual cable length. Now, the specification of USB 3 cable length is not defined. It's the electrical specifications of the cable itself is what is defined. So depending on the quality of the cable that you use, you will have different lengths that work correctly. So currently, Point Grey is shipping 3-meter cables, and we're doing very close examination of 5-meter cables. Now, in addition to that, there are active repeater solutions which are using both coax and optical repeaters to get to longer lengths. So if you are, considering the interfaces, this would be one thing that, may not be as good as some of the other interfaces. Now, the other thing that comes up a lot is, well, how reliable is USB 3? Is USB 3 actually suitable for machine vision or not? So, instead of just saying, yeah, it's very, very reliable, don't worry about it, it's great. What I wanted to do is give you some, specific information about how we test USB 3 to make sure that it is, in fact, reliable. So, one of the things that we've done for months and months now is to run a long-term streaming test, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to essentially uncover any hard-to-find problems. So, sure enough, in order to make sure that it is working correctly, we have, over the course of doing this test, found issues which we fixed. Any design revisions that we make require us to do a 3-day test. So the typical test that we do is we'll take 2 cameras running at 2 megapixels, 60 frames per second, so that's 120 megabytes per second, and we'll run them for 3 days, producing about 31 million images. So if that test passes, then we basically say, okay, this design revision is good. So in addition to that, what we do is we do thousands of arrival and removal tests, and that means, basically we have a system to plug and unplug the camera thousands of times to make sure that the cameras show up and make sure that they're reliable. And then finally, there is a nice cable testing device from Quantum Parametrics, which can be used for making sure the cables and the system are done correctly, and that's pictured over there. So I was talking about reliability, let's talk a little bit about robustness. So one of the really important things that I actually learned when I came here for the first time, or when I entered the industry about 15 years ago, is that people wanted to know, do you have locking connectors? And yes, there's a variety of suppliers right now that are providing locking connectors. Elysian Tech, that is located just behind you, and Unix have a variety of cameras. And we're also starting to see, interesting right-angle connectors and things like that. So the industry is really starting to embrace USB 3. The other thing that Point Grey has done is we're going to actually be providing our own host controller card, so that you're basically, the equipment that you're buying as much as possible is coming from one vendor, so that it's all end-to-end handled by one vendor. We have our own driver, like I already mentioned. There's also on-camera buffering if you want to be absolutely sure that the image is acquired, and you can resend it should you ever need it to do that. There's also other sensors within the camera which are not necessarily specific to USB 3, but they do help out with the robustness of the system. And then also, there are on-camera diagnostic systems, so skip frame counters, link recovery counters, transmit failure counters, and things like that. So, what I've done so far is basically told you about what USB 3 does. And what I want to, sort of shift a little bit about, well, how does it apply to machine vision? Why is USB 3 good for machine vision? So, the first and foremost is the amount of bandwidth that you get. And we're starting to see actually a lot of sensors which are going a lot faster than the current interfaces. And when I say interfaces that don't require frame grabbers can do today. So if you have a faster sensor, larger sensor, you have higher bit depth, if you do color processing, or if you have many cameras, you will need USB 3. The other reason that USB 3 is important is cost. So if you have a camera link solution, for example, today, or you're doing link aggregation or something like that, say using GigE, that's going to be a lot more expensive solution than if you basically have a PC which has USB 3 on it, and you buy, you spend some good, a bit of money on the cable, but certainly not as much money as you would have to spend on a camera link cable, for example. And also, there are people who are using USB 2, so it has to be backwards compatible, and there are people who actually provide a solution, a scanner of some kind, for example, that does not come with the PC itself. And in those situations, USB, and in this case USB 3, are very well suited as well. Now, I think to me, probably the most exciting thing so far has been the response of this industry to USB 3. So you will see here almost 20 different companies have gotten together in September of this year to basically discuss standardization of USB 3. And so as a result, USB 3 Vision was created. And basically, we're at the stage right now where there's a white paper which sort of outlines the general discussion that occurred. And what's incredible, I don't know how many of you guys have actually been to a standards meeting, but usually there's a lot of discussion and a lot of argument and so on. And what was incredible about this meeting was that people in general just sort of agreed and just sort of moved forward. And it's incredible the amount of cooperation there is actually around USB 3. So what I've done here is I've outlined 3 events that are at this show. Tomorrow there's a presentation about the details of the standard as it is today. There's also a meeting where you can attend and basically discuss and contribute to the standard itself, and it's open to anybody who wants to attend. And also, AIA will be giving an update on the standard itself. So depending on your availability and when you want, these are 3 events where you can learn more about USB. And from Point Grey's side, because the standard doesn't exist yet, we're using the interfaces and the standards that we have done previously. Primarily, essentially, the way of talking to FireWire cameras. That's how we've done USB 2 as well. But we're prepared to support the standard once it actually exists. This slide just sort of gives you a very quick overview and a comparison of interfaces, and no interface presentation is ever complete without having a table like this. And because I'm running out of time, I will not go through all the details of this, but this presentation is available on the webpage, so you will be able to sort of compare things. It's the consumer acceptance and the multiple cameras and the fact that there will be a vision standard, a good power supply, and the amount of bandwidth is what really distinguishes USB 3 from all the other interfaces. This slide is intended to just sort of show you how the interfaces stack up in terms of the size of the pipe that you have. So the X is the number of megapixels in a given sensor, and the Y is the frame rate. And you can sort of see kind of where USB 3 fits. So it's not all the way to what CameraLink can do, but it's certainly a lot more than what FireWire or Gigabit Ethernet or USB 2 can do. Now, one of the questions that comes up a lot, you bring up USB 3 and somebody right away says, what about Thunderbolt? So Thunderbolt has some interesting advantages when you start looking at them from the top. So it has 10 gigabits per second bandwidth. It combines, I wouldn't say necessarily this is advantage, but it combines PCI DisplayPort and PCI Express, and it also gives you a small connector. So basically what you see here is there's PCI Express, there's DisplayPort, they're put on one cable, and on the other side, pop they out separate. So if you were to imagine that on one side you have a PC and on the other side you have a camera, I'm not sure that you need DisplayPort. You're not going to be displaying anything on your camera. And PCI Express, some of you who have been to this show about 4 years ago, 4 years ago, in 2008, Point Grey actually showed a PCI Express camera. So we actually connected a PCI Express cable, which you can buy. So you just basically have a connector with almost no, card with almost no components on it. You bring PCI Express out and you plug it straight into the camera. So essentially, the question is, well, what's the advantage of Thunderbolt? What is it that it does that just bringing PCI Express straight out to the camera does not do? And it's not exactly clear to us, which is why we don't have any product plans right now. But we are watching it and we'll see what happens. But in general, right now as it stands, from our point of view, USB 3 is a perfect stepping stone in terms of the interfaces that are available today. Now, as I was going, you may have noticed that I used a whole bunch of different USB logos. So what I'd like to just sort of take a moment for you to understand what all these various logos mean. So the top left is the official USB 3 compliance logo, which is a consumer label. And what that means is that when you have a cell phone and you need to charge it in a certain way, the cell phone itself needs to go to sleep in a graceful way and things like that. There are certain things that in the consumer space you have to do on the device to make sure that it complies with the standard. And if you do, that's what that logo signifies. Now, in our industry, that is not something that is needed. Your camera typically doesn't go to sleep when it's supposed to be working in the factory, right? So what Point Grey has done, because we are not USB 3 SuperSpeed compliant at this point, we've created a logo ourselves, which indicates USB 3, and some other camera vendors have done a similar thing. So just so that you understand what these things mean. Top right is the machine vision standards logo. So that signifies that that camera actually meets the machine vision standard, and in theory, once the standard exists and so on, if the software and the camera are USB 3 vision compliant, you can plug them together and they'll work nicely. The bottom one, the bottom right, is just sort of for you, once you buy your laptop and so on, which has USB 3, the logo there is actually the label of the port itself, and if the port is not labeled, it'll be blue. Okay? So blue, so to speak, is the color of USB 3. So this is just kind of a little bit of background. Now, in the machine vision side, what's exciting is that in addition to cables and the cameras and the interface, we're also starting to see some very interesting devices coming out. So for example, AdLink has a fanless PC, embedded PC, which has 2 USB 3 ports on it. IOI Technology actually has a very interesting card, which has 4 ports on it. So you can plug in basically 4 devices directly into the card and then bring it into the PCI Express bus. So we're going to be seeing more and more of devices like this. Also, what's extremely exciting is that we're starting to see a whole variety of USB 3 cameras coming out as well. So IDS is showing, and they're also tiny. They're just about all of them are quite tiny. So IDS, Basler, Xemia are showing very small cameras, and Artray actually has been showing USB 3 cameras for a while in Japan. So Point Grey, of course, has USB 3 cameras as well. Our focus has been first on taking sensors which produce a lot of pixels and put them in first. And sensors that produce a lot of pixels tend to be CMOS sensors. So for example, we have a camera that can do 1080p 60, which is 120 megabytes per second, selling for about $800 US. So just to kind of give you an idea of where things are. And of course, more and more USB 3 cameras will be coming. So USB 3 is here. The USB 3 is here because it's available in the consumer market in large volumes. USB 3 fits the needs of the vision industry. Vision standard is in the works. There's many accessories and ways of putting things together. And finally, USB cameras are shipping today. Not in those volumes though, yet. Thank you.